Michael Reed was born in 1949 at Bexley Maternity Home, Barnhurst, Kent. His father worked at Bexley Station and the family lived in Dartford until Michael married in 1971. Michael's granny was born in the barracks at Deal, a daughter of a Royal Marine Sergeant who lived in Nelson Terrace. They later relocated to Dulwich in the early 1900s. On retirement in 1949, his grandparents moved back to Deal, occupying a cottage in College Road. Then in 1951 they moved to Sandown Road, before relocating once again to Gladstone Road in the late 1950s. Telephones were a privilege in those long ago days. Not many people had one, so his father would send a letter to his grandparents to tell them they would be arriving in Deal on a specific day. Travelling down on the old steam trains that were still in operation until the 1960s. A brief stroll along the seafront was always first on the arrival list, then off to his grandparents' house for an early lunch. Walking from Warmer along the seafront to the pier was a spectacular sight. Numerous boats and winches covered the beach along its full length. The old boatmen would be sitting on their beach boxes, puffing on their pipes and taking a pinch of snuff, while others were occupied in telling stories to the visitor about some rescue they had done on the Goodwin Sands, hoping to gain a penny or two from their story. Taking a restful break in one of the modernist shelters that were on the promenade was wonderful. You could sit peacefully and stare out to sea and observe the different kinds of shipping that was passing through the downs. If the weather was warm, there was nothing better than to paddle in the sea, followed up by a relaxing spell on the beach before returning to his grandparents' house for tea. There were at least 3 telescopes along the foreshore then, and for a 3p piece you could gain a good view of the Goodwin Sands. The masts of many ships were visible, and it was interesting to see the sands as they dried out at low tide. Taking a stroll along the continuous stretch of shingle at the north end of Deal brought you up to the remains of an old brick building called the Seagirt. This was a huge building that protruded out into the sea. It was amazing to stand and watch the waves hit the building at high water and see the spray being thrown high into the air. One very foggy day in the 1950s, whilst walking along the seafront, he watched hundreds of parts ready for the construction of the new pier being unloaded and placed on the beach. The old cranes were creaking and groaning under the strain of the heavy metal being lifted off the lorries. A rusty old shipwreck lay near the foreshore off Deal Castle. This was the James Harrod, a wartime casualty. Men were working hard cutting up the wreck and winding the pieces of metal ashore with a huge winch which occupied a place on the beach near the castle. Wandering through the old alleyways up to the magical shaped signal box and level crossing in Albert Road was a favourite. Joining the local boys and watching them as they put a penny on the railway line, then picked it up again after the steam train had flattened it. These pennies came out twice their size. A visit to Johnny Newin's toy shop, which was opposite Union Road in the High Street, was an experience a lad could never forget. The shop front was full of bicycles. He used to sell these and had a large store out the back where he repaired bikes. There were books and puzzles, hundreds of toys and dolls, a mecca for a youngster. But the most exciting part about the toy shop was the toy trains, a wide variety of Hornby engines, carriages and tracks. Michael, like many of us, bought items for his model railway from here, out of his pocket money, which had been hard earned. In the late 1960s, Michael's father acquired a car, so the journey to Deal was down the newly opened M2 motorway and onto the A2 at Sandwich and along the Deal Road. On arriving in the evening, a stroll along the seafront would be complemented by the sound of rock and roll music, which came roaring out of DeVito's Cafe. This was occupied mainly by local girls and Royal Marines who were having a great time. Going inside was always avoided though, as fights were frequent between the Marines and the locals. Michael's aunt and family moved to Deal from Yorkshire in the late 1970s, and on visiting them, he and his wife always parked on the seafront near the Royal Hotel and went for a stroll before going to his aunt's house in Allenby Avenue. He recalls passing a gentleman on the seafront one day who looked like Charles Hawtrey. On mentioning this to his cousin, he was told, "Oh yes, it was he you saw." He found out later years that Charles Autrey had a house in Middle Street which caught fire, but that's another story. This is a short recollection of Michael Reed's memoirs during his visits to Deal in the old days, when Deal was still a thriving fishing town with an active military barracks.